Hey guys, I know the year 2021 has been over for quite a bit now. It's now almost April of 2022, but I decided to do a video listing off my top 15 favorite films to come out last year. Number 15 on my list is Godzilla vs. Kong, and I'm not gonna claim that this was necessarily a great movie. It certainly wasn't, but as a lifelong Godzilla fan, dear God, this movie made me smile. This was also the first movie I saw in the theaters after the whole lockdown of 2020, so the film was also kind of special to me in that regard. Now, this is the fourth film of Legendary's MonsterVerse. It's a sequel to 2014's Godzilla and 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, as well as a direct sequel to 2017's Kong Skull Island. And this is a loose remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which, by the way, was actually my first Godzilla movie and my first King Kong movie. And again, I'm not going to claim that this movie didn't have its problems. It certainly did. This is not one of the better Godzilla movies. It's not one of the better King Kong movies. Hell, it's not even one of the better films of Legendary's MonsterVerse, but it's a film that also 100% knows what it is. And it's just a really fun movie. And this film, again, as a lifelong Godzilla fan, this film really did sort of awaken my inner child. Number 14 on my list is a movie that I'll admit, when I first saw it, I was a little iffy on it, but when I saw it again, and when I thought about it more, I was like, you know what? This is actually a really good movie, and that's Candyman, Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta's sequel/reboot to the Candyman franchise. Now, while I still think the movie has its problems, this is easily the best of the Candyman sequels, and it's the only one of the sequels to actually do justice to the original film. And while it is a slightly new take on the Candyman mythology, frankly, this movie is more true to the tone and themes of the original film than Candyman 2 and 3 were. Now, a lot of people have complained that the film is apparently too political, and I'm like, have you not seen the original Candyman? Granted, you could argue that the original Candyman was a little more subtle in its political agenda, but still, given the current political climate, I understand why the film has the point of view that it does. Number 13 is Licorice Pizza, the most recent film from Paul Thomas Anderson. The movie is a coming-of-age comedy drama set in the early 1970s about a teenage actor who is struggling to make it in show business while also trying to start up his own businesses with some friends of his, as well as his somewhat questionable relationship with a woman who is 10 years his senior. But Licorice Pizza, it's a sweet film, it's a funny film, it's a delightfully weird film, and Bradley Cooper freaking steals the movie as John Peters. Number 12 on my list is Clerk, a really fascinating documentary on the life and films of Kevin Smith. I highly recommend this if you're a Kevin Smith fan. It's just a really interesting look at his life and career, and it talks about his relationships with people like Jason Mewes, his daughter, his wife. They interview some family members of his. It, of course, addresses the elephant in the room of Harvey Weinstein at one point in the documentary. Not as much as I think it probably should have, but it does talk about that. It, of course, goes into the heart attack that Kevin Smith suffered a few years ago. Again, just a really well done documentary on a really interesting filmmaker. Number 11 is Stillwater, a really powerful drama in which Matt Damon plays an American man whose daughter has been jailed in another country for murder, and it's about his desperate quest to prove his daughter's innocence, but throughout the film you get some hints that maybe his daughter wasn't as innocent as he thought she was. Like I said, it's a really powerful drama, but it's also an interesting commentary on society in general. Number 10 on my list is The Suicide Squad, James Gunn's entry into the DC Extended Universe. Now, I hated the first Suicide Squad movie, so I had relatively low expectations going into this, even though I do like James Gunn. But dear God, this is everything that the first movie should have been Candyman, and more. Now, as much as I love the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, you could tell that this is James Gunn unchained. Like, DC is just letting him go crazy with this movie, and I love them all the more for it. And the movie just brilliantly messes around with all these different genres. It goes from being a superhero action movie, to a political thriller, to a war movie, to a horror comedy, and the movie even becomes a zombie film and a kaiju film by the end. Now, the DCEU has definitely been a very hit-or-miss series, and as much as I love Shazam, I think this is easily the best of the DCEU so far. Number 9 on my list is Nobody, an absolutely brilliant action comedy that I would almost describe as a more self-aware version of John Wick. But this movie was so much damn fun. Bob Odenkirk is awesome in the movie, but who really stole the movie, I think, is Christopher Lloyd, who I knew was going to be in the film, but I was not expecting his role to be as big as it was. Number 8 on my list is Dune, which is actually part 1 of what's intended to be a 2-part movie. Now, I've never read the book by Frank Herbert. I have seen the David Lynch movie, which I like quite a bit, but from what I understand, both this and the David Lynch movie definitely take liberties with the source material. Now, something I really appreciated about this movie is even though it was being sort of promoted as a Star Wars-esque space opera epic, which it was for the most part, and to be fair, the original novel Dune is one of the things that inspired Star Wars. Really what this was it was a political drama with a sci-fi setting, which from what I understand is what the book is like. And I really appreciated how we have sort of a slower paced sci-fi epic being promoted to the mainstream, and the movie is just visually breathtaking. Number 7 is In the Earth from Ben Wheatley. Now, from what I understand, this movie was shot during the pandemic, and it's kind of about the pandemic, but also kind of not at the same time. Like, the movie is set during a global pandemic, but you're not sure if they're talking about the one that we're currently going through or a fictional pandemic. But the movie is about a scientist and a park ranger who go into the woods looking for 2 scientists who went missing, and they end up encountering an evil presence in the woods. And that's really all I want to say without giving too much away. But In the Earth was a very well done and very creepy horror film, and there are some really shocking scenes in this movie. Now, I guess you could put it into the category of ecological horror, because there is sort of a commentary about man's relation to nature in the film. But this movie really reminded me of the works of Nigel Neal, especially with the implication of what this creature in the woods actually is. It felt like something right out of one of the Quatermass movies. Number 6 on my list is Judas and the Black Messiah, which is about the assassination of Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers. Now, I'll admit, I know very little about the actual true story that this movie is based on, but this was a really powerful drama about race, and even though it's taken place in the late 60s, a lot of the themes of the film are still very much relevant to today. Number 5 on my list, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be saying the name of this movie right, but I believe it's pronounced Titane or Titane. I'm not really sure how to properly pronounce the title of the movie, but it's a French film. It's actually from the same director as Raw, which is another really good movie. Now, this is one of those movies where I feel the less you know about it, the better, I think. All I'm gonna say is it's about a female serial killer who has a dream where she fucks a car, and then she ends up pregnant. And that's literally all I want to say about the plot of the film, but believe me when I say that barely even scratches the surface of what's in this movie. This is one of the weirdest and most insane horror films I've ever seen, but there are also points in the movie that are profoundly moving, and the movie combines Cronenbergian body horror with real compelling human drama. Number 4 on my list is The Green Knight. Now, I know this is based on an old legend and an epic poem that was written during the Middle Ages. Now, I've never read the source material, but I can imagine that the movie probably does take some liberties. And much like Dune, this is just a visually stunning film, and I like how even though it is a fantasy film, it does try to remain relatively grounded in terms of how society was during the time period this is supposed to be taking place, and like how grimy the characters are and how dirty they are. Again, it feels very realistic for that time period, despite all the supernatural and the fantasy stuff that's in the film. And the movie deals with a lot of themes of masculinity and responsibility, as well as man's arrogance towards nature, and it's also very much a commentary about mortality and about death. And it's also kind of a Christmas movie as well. It actually is set during Christmas. But it's an absolutely fantastic film. Number 3 on my list is Guillermo del Toro's remake of Nightmare Alley. Now, I've never seen the original film, and I've never read the book, so I really have nothing to compare this to, but I'm gonna be honest, I actually think this might be Guillermo del Toro's best American film. Now, don't get me wrong, the movie's nowhere near as good as some of his Spanish films like Devil's Backbone or Pan's Labyrinth, but in terms of his American films, again, I think this might be the best one. Bradley Cooper does an amazing job as this character who, at first, seems to be relatively likable, but you realize that under the surface, he's a sleazy son of a bitch, and he only gets worse as the movie goes on, but as it goes on, you see how his greed just digs him into a deeper and deeper hole. And I do have to say, looking at the carnival scenes in this movie, I really want to see Guillermo del Toro do a remake of Freaks now. I know it's probably never going to happen because that story is kind of problematic by today's standards, but still, if he ever got an opportunity to, I could really see him doing a remake of Freaks. Number 2 on my list is Pig, in which Nicolas Cage plays a truffle farmer whose truffle pig is stolen from him, and throughout the film he goes on this journey to get this pig back. Now, this could have easily have been an over-the-top John Wick-style revenge movie, which I think is what a lot of people were expecting this to be, and don't get me wrong, I would have loved that too, but I was pleasantly surprised when I saw that this was actually a really compelling human drama about grief and loss. And this might easily be one of Nicolas Cage's best performances in years, and the movie is also an interesting look at sort of the seedier side of the restaurant industry. Granted, I don't know how accurate the movie is to all that, or if it's just trying to be sort of satirical. And my number 1 favorite film of 2021 was Spider-Man No Way Home, the third film of the Tom Holland Spider-Man trilogy, which is part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this movie works as both another installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as a love letter and a send-up to the Spider-Man franchise in general, because this movie uses the whole multiverse concept to tie in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and the Amazing Spider-Man movies into the continuity of the MCU by suggesting that those Spider-Man films were taking place on parallel Earths. And the movie is effectively a crossover between the MCU Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man series, and the Amazing Spider-Man series, and it does it in a really clever and brilliant way. And the movie just has a lot of heart, and I love how when you see these characters from these other Spider-Man franchises show up in this, it's not just cameos, they're legitimate characters in the movie. Now, I'm not going to claim that the movie was perfect perfect by any means. It certainly did have plot holes, but it was still just a fun movie, and it was my personal favorite film of last year. Now, I decided to end this video off with a bonus list. Because I never did one of these kinds of videos at the end of 2020, I decided to end this video off with a list of my top 5 favorite films to come out in 2020. Now, I'm going to try to get through this list relatively quickly. Number 5 on this list is The Color Out of Space, Richard Stanley's adaptation of the classic H.P. Lovecraft story. This was a wild and freaking terrifying movie. Like, there's one particular scene in this movie that still haunts me ever since I saw it. Now, Richard Stanley is a filmmaker who really has been screwed over by Hollywood, and it was great to see this comeback film from him. Unfortunately, he has had some allegations against him recently, and if they're true, I feel no sympathy for him at all. But because of that, I'm not sure if he's gonna do another movie now. But again, leaving aside the allegations against him and whether or not they're true, this was a really good movie. Number 4 is Freaky, which is basically a horror comedy version of Freaky Friday. It's about a girl who switches bodies with a serial killer, but it's a really funny movie. I definitely recommend it. Number 3 on this list is The Lodge, one of the darkest and most depressing and also most fucked up horror films I've seen in recent years. Now, the movie follows 2 kids who are staying at their father's lodge with their father's new girlfriend, who is actually the only surviving member of a Heaven's Gate or Jim Jones-style cult that committed a mass suicide, and they're already resentful towards her because of the suicide of their mother, which they kind of blame on her, and they're already distrustful of her because she was in this cult. That's really all I want to say about this movie, but this was a really powerful film. Number 2 on this list is Saint Maud, a really powerful and really scary horror drama film about religious fanaticism. And my number 1 favorite film to come out in 2020 is Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, which is a documentary on the life of Mark Patton, who played Jesse in A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, which for the longest time was kind of considered to be the black sheep of that franchise, but in recent years has gotten a real critical reevaluation. And the film is a really interesting look into not just the fandom of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, but also into the life of Mark Patton, dealing with his homosexuality, and the movie is also very much about the struggles that gay actors in general had to deal with in the 1980s, particularly with the AIDS crisis. And even as a heterosexual man, I found this movie to be deeply moving. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave in the comments what some of your favorite films of 2021 or 2020 were, and let me know what you thought of my picks. Bye.